Our first guest this evening is Robert Marton. He's a Mexican. He's from south of the border. He's the Melbourne Director of City Bible Forum, which is a non-denominational Christian organisation. You might ask Robert later what that means, because I've got no idea. But anyway, they seek to conform, so the City Bible Forum seeks to conform all its activities with the teaching of the Bible. It appears to seek to proselytise and empower Christianity. Robert regularly speaks and writes blogs about modern atheism. Robert was born an atheist, but he's not so sure anymore. Robert blogs at atheistforumwordpress.com. Don't be misled by what I'm saying, he's a Christian. Robert also had some essays published in the book Disbelieving Disbelief, published in 2012. Our second guest to my left is Raphael Lataster. He's professionally a secular PhD researcher at the University of Sydney, studies in religion. Despite his position, he is an atheist, and he teaches on religion at various institutions. He is forging an impressive career as a secular academic, publishing numerous research articles on the implausibility of theism and Christianity, and has only yesterday won an award at the University of Sydney for excellence in teaching. His first book, available tonight at the table, at the back, went to #1 on Amazon for atheism and religious philosophy category, displacing Richard Dawkins' magnum opus. And his second, which effectively proves that Jesus didn't exist, shall arrive within days. That's not Jesus arriving within days. That's the book's going to arrive. He hopes to eventually convince sophisticated apologists, like our friend Robert here, of the virtual impossibility of theism, and wishes to one day debate noted apologist William Lane. Is it Lane or Lane? Lane or Lane Craig. This evening, these two gentlemen will debate, is God really there? What they're really debating is whether the Abrahamic God is really there. I don't know if either of our debaters have any ideas or certainties about the Greek, Russian, Chinese, or Hindu, or any other gods. The format this evening will be a 30-minute discussion by each participant, followed by 8 minutes for critiquing. We'll have a 10-minute drinks and bathroom break, hopefully not both. Then there'll be about 40 minutes of question time, followed by a 3-minute summation by Robert and Raphael. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to ask you to give Robert a very warm welcome.
Well, thanks very much, and thank you very much for the kind invitation, Steve. Thanks very much for coming. Hopefully, thank you for trying to listen to me at least. I've done some pretty foolish things in my time, like going to a food court, eating the medium Indian, thinking that was going to adequately prepare me for Indian food in India itself. That didn't quite work. Or I was foolish one time when I realised that you actually have to take the shells off pistachio nuts before eating them. They were particularly crunchy. Also, one day when I turned up to my first day at Bible college without a Bible. Or perhaps a foolish thing to do is arguing a coherent case for theism at the usual meet-up of the Sydney Atheists. I've done some foolish things, but am I foolish for believing that God is really there? That was meant to be a rhetorical question, actually. And that's the topic for this evening. I do believe that God is really there, and I do live my life on that assumption. Now, as I begin, I want to properly define what I mean by God and what I mean by there. For I could say that, for example, this little God that I picked up this afternoon in Newtown, Ganesh, we could say that it's a God, and he's really there. Or we could say the Higgs boson particle, which is, according to science, this God particle is really there as well. Or we could even say that ex-AFL footballer Gary Ablett, whose nickname's God, and some might have thought he's even coming tonight, but if that was you, I'm really sorry that he's not here. But you could argue, though, that the no case there would be in place because he's obviously not here. But that's not what I mean. What I mean is God in the sense of a maximally great being who created and supervenes the universe. And by there, what I mean is that he is objectively there. that he exists outside human construction or apprehension, and perhaps he's even watching this debate right now. Now, I believe that God is there, that he exists. I know him, he knows me, and he loves me. So as we begin to debate this question tonight, is God really there? I want to ask a prior and a very crucial question. What would it take to convince you that God is really there? God is by definition spiritual, invisible, immaterial. So what would convince you that he really is there? Now there's some who have admitted to me that nothing will convince me. A blogger once said that straight out to me. And then also atheist philosopher Peter Bayesian admitted something very similar in a dialogue earlier this year that I hosted in Melbourne. He used Bill Maher's test to say that even if Jesus Christ appeared at the halftime show during the Super Bowl and turned all the nachos into loaves and fishes, Bayesian admitted even then he still wouldn't believe. So, is this you? If it is, well, probably wasting your time. I doubt that I'm going to say anything that's going to change your mind, because your position is essentially unfalsifiable. Now, the standard of proof used in criminal cases is beyond reasonable doubt. Yet, if you are hyper-skeptical, even this standard won't satisfy you, because there will always be doubt. So even with a clear criminal conviction, there's always doubt. Maybe they lied, maybe someone impersonated them, maybe the evidence has been tampered with, or maybe even it was magic. If you're that skeptical, then you'll never be able to put a criminal behind bars, because there will always be a way out. You can never prove that someone did a crime with complete certainty. And perhaps this is the way you think about God. I confess that I have doubts about God. I can't prove God is there the same way that I can prove a mathematical theorem. But I think that I can demonstrate that God is there beyond reasonable doubt, if you're open to that possibility. So is God really there? Well, it's been almost the universal human experience across cultures and times to believe in some higher power. And even today, over 60% of Australians believe in God or a higher power. And one of the reasons for this is a common human intuitive experience that there is something out there. And also many believe that God is the best explanation for everything that exists. We look at the world and we think that it really did come from an intelligent agent. An artwork requires an artist. I believe that theism, the belief that God is really there, also best explains many aspects of our human experience. Our certainty regarding morality, our longing for justice, the success of hope, and the desire for meaning all make more sense in the universe where God is there, rather than in an amoral, hopeless, meaningless, atheist universe. So for Raphael to continue his impressive, unbeaten debating run tonight, he'll have to demonstrate that God really isn't there. Now this is more than just showing the arguments that I rally for God don't fail, but it also that God isn't the best explanation for all that exists and for all our experience. For example, he needs to demonstrate, beyond reasonable doubt, that a universe can begin without an agent, that an artwork doesn't require an artist. So there are many ways to suggest that God is really there. But to me, the most convincing reason to believe that he's really there is because he's been here. He's revealed himself. He stepped out of the immaterial to enter the material in the person of Jesus Christ. He's done exactly what Bill Maher demanded to do. He revealed himself in history. Not a Super Bowl halftime show, but among the thriving and cosmopolitan culture of first century Palestine. Now, I can't see how God could be any clearer than that. Perhaps Raphael could offer some suggestions on how he could be clearer. Now, interestingly, Peter Bayesian admitted that even if this did happen, remember, he said that it wouldn't convince him. Now, Jesus said and did some extraordinary things, yet one of the most extraordinary, particularly given the cultural context in which he lived, was that he claimed to be God. Jesus acted like God, did the works of God, had the wisdom of God, was resurrected from the dead by God, and was worshipped by God. So worshipped as God by monotheistic Jews. Now, if this were true, if Jesus was God, and this could be demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt, then this would have to be evidence for God, wouldn't it? Now, it's becoming increasingly common to suggest that the stories about Jesus can't be trusted because he's just a legend, a mythical figure. Now, this actually, I think, creates more problems than it solves. Because two questions then need to be answered. Who created him, and for what purpose? In fact, the whole Jesus myth hypothesis is an extraordinarily fringe idea in modern historical Jesus scholarship. Now, earlier this year, I heard at another event I was at, leading atheist apologist Matt Dillahunty make a brilliant argument which I think can be applied against the Jesus myth position. He was responding to the credibility of young Earth creation, the scholarship of young Earth creationist scientists. Now, Dillahunty acknowledged that there were scientists with PhDs who believed in a young Earth. Then he asked us to put all those scholars into his little finger, and they were represented by his little finger. And then he proposed a comparison, which were all the scientists who didn't believe in a young Earth, which would stretch right across the street. Now, this is not a fallacious argument to popularity, but as Dillahunty says, among the experts, about the people who know about this stuff, there is an overwhelming consensus that the universe is not young. Similarly, there is an overwhelming consensus among the experts, even skeptical scholars like Marton, to say that Jesus was not a myth. So if you want to entertain the suggestion that Jesus didn't exist, then you have to entertain the suggestion that young Earth creationists with PhDs might also be right. Jesus was a real historical person. But perhaps the stories about his divinity were built up over time, as Ehrman himself argues in his book. Well, this crucially overlooks a couple of things, and one of them is that the fact that Jesus' divinity was not developed in a polytheistic Greek or Roman context, but in a by monotheistic Jews who didn't invent new gods. Further, Jesus' divinity was proclaimed in the earliest historical information we have about Jesus. For example, an early hymn that the Apostle Paul quotes in Philippians 2 in the early 60s before any of the Gospels were finished refers to Jesus as very nature God. And Jesus is also, in this hymn, given the honour that every knee would bow to him. And honour, as Isaiah 45 says, is only for the one and only God. Jesus himself claims to be God, and he made this claim seem reasonable. An example is in Mark chapter 2, verses 1 to 12, where Jesus made unambiguous claims to be God. He claims to forgive sins, something that only God can do, because the offended party is the only one who can forgive. Now, the response of the Jewish leaders to this incident was predictable and correct. They say, why does this fellow talk like this? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? They draw the conclusion that he's taking the place of God. He's claiming to be God. And at this point, we have just three options to respond to Jesus. Jesus was wrong, and he knew it, which would make him to be a liar or a joker. Jesus was wrong, and he didn't know it, which would make him a crazy guy. Or he wasn't wrong at all, and that he was speaking the truth. And if he was speaking the truth, then this would have to be evidence for God, wouldn't it? These are the three only logical options that there are. He was a liar, a lunatic, or the Lord. And we must work out who he was. Now, for example, Steve, our moderator here, said tonight, okay, everyone, I forgive your sins, I'm God. I doubt that we'd actually accept his claim. Why should we believe Steve's words? What's the first question you're going to ask him? Well, maybe the first question I'd say, well, okay, prove it. You demonstrate that it's reasonable for me to believe that you're really God. Now, how could he do that? How could he demonstrate that he really was God? Well, this is precisely what Jesus was anticipating. To demonstrate that his words have power, he raises the paradigm. The actions and the act work together to provide a reasonable reason to believe that Jesus was who he claimed to be. Anyone can claim to be God, but I don't think anyone could make a paralytic walk with just a word. So if Steve simply said a word to me and said, Rob, you no longer need your glasses, and woof, I could take my glasses off and not confuse my wife with the next door neighbour, which would potentially be quite awkward. But you'd have to take his claim to divinity a little bit more seriously, wouldn't you? Most people in history have never ever claimed to be God themselves. Buddha, Muhammad, Jim Jones, Gary Ablett have never claimed to be God. Yet Jesus did, and he backed up his claim with something impressive that would make his claim credible. Now, this isn't going to satisfy the hyper-skeptic or the one who assumes that miracles can't happen. But it was convincing to a group of Jewish monotheists trying to figure out who Jesus was. And these eyewitnesses wrote down what they saw and spoke to other people who also wrote down their recollections. Now, these followers gained very little from the story in terms of money, sex, or political gain. In fact, most of his earlier followers were persecuted and died for their beliefs. So if God came down and interacted with the world, how do you think we could best record this? Well, you'd write something down, would you not? Wouldn't this be the best medium to record the remarkable things which they had seen? I can't think of any other way in which they could have reported what they saw. And the documentary evidence of Jesus is extraordinary. There are more documents closer to the dates of the events recorded for the penniless preacher from Nazareth than for any other ancient figure, including emperors, Victorians, generals, philosophers, or best-selling authors. On the sources for Jesus, Marton concludes that they are pretty astounding for an ancient figure of any kind. It's pretty extraordinary, isn't it? So to me, as I've contemplated atheism, I'm confronted by the great Jesus problem. I can't accept atheism because of the claims and the historical reality of Jesus. I could perhaps be a deist and accept a force, something like a force behind the universe. But the reality of Jesus coming into the world is reasonable evidence to me that God really is there. God really is there because He was here.
Thank you very much, Robert. I'd now like to ask Raphael to take the stand.
Alrighty, thanks everyone for coming. Despite the rain, Black Friday is clearly living up to its name. So it's a bit ridiculous. We had a few calamities on the way here and I thought, gee, we don't even need a debate. I think God does exist. Clearly doesn't want us doing this here tonight. Now, we've got rebuttal time after, don't we?
Sure.
So yeah, so I won't really deal with what Robert was talking about. I will give my own little case, if you will, and it actually overlaps a little bit with what Robert was talking about. First of all, this chair is for William Lane Craig, who couldn't make it here tonight. I invited him. He refused several times. He knows I'm working on a PhD thesis debunking his entire case for God's existence. I just want to mention it.
Could you?
Sure. I just want to mention it because Richard Dawkins told me to leave that chair for Craig because Craig did the same thing to Dawkins when he rejected Craig's advances. Alright, so what we're going to first do is, we won't deal too much with Marton's arguments. We'll talk about what generally is accepted as the best evidence for God, and I'll show you how that doesn't work. And then I'll go on the offensive and show you that theism, as both Robert and Steve were talking about, we're talking about the Abrahamic God, generally when we're talking about God. I'll show you that that God concept is very improbable. Virtually impossible. Okay, so first we've got our little defensive case here. First we'll talk about evidence. I know Robert alluded to that as well. Usually the sophisticated apologist will come up with arguments and build a cumulative case from them. And you have deductive arguments which, if they're logically valid and the premises are all correct, then you have guaranteed conclusion. Now we generally don't deal with that. That's very difficult to do in philosophy. Probably the only thing I'd grant you that we know for certain is that we as individuals exist. We probably can't even be certain that the other person in front of us exists. So I'll give you that one, but apart from that, we probably don't know anything with certainty, so we might not expect that from both sides. But what we can do, and what we ought to do, is use probabilities. We want to find out what's probably true. We can't find out what actually is true, most likely, but we want to try and find out what's probably true, and we need a method for that. We can't just make grand claims or raise various hypotheses. We need to actually argue that our hypotheses are the more probable hypotheses. I don't think we've seen that yet tonight, but that is how you'd be able to prove God's existence. Postmodernists will disagree with what I just said, but if there's any postmodernists here, I don't think you're going to have a good time tonight. it's pretty pointless. I like to think of myself as a pseudo-postmodernist. It's a nice idea to be all respectful of other people's cultures and ideas, but truth doesn't work that way. Science doesn't work that way. The truth is not a democracy. We want to find out what's probably true, not what is possibly true. If we're just talking about possibilities, there's no point for any of this. No one's going to convince anyone of anything. Last point is basically just that for a good case for God, you want to see some arguments for God that together as a case all make it, say, 50% or more probable. Some would expect more. I mean, I think in science we'd expect 95 to 97% certainty. I don't think we heard any percentage yet tonight. But that's probably what you want to see. You want to see more than 50% at least. I'd be quite happy with, I don't know, 70-ish%. Okay, so we'll walk through briefly the arguments. There's the contingency argument. I'm basically going to have this cross here throughout all these slides because all the big arguments for God, they're all based on presuppositions that rational outsiders to the discussion do not necessarily accept. It doesn't mean that a strong atheist or a naturalist, just whoever's not committed regarding, say, the case for theism, they will say, well, I don't accept that premise. And one of the early and classic arguments is the cosmological argument from contingency, and that basically says, I don't think I'm in that. That basically says that the universe is unnecessary and God is necessary. And God serves as the explanation for the universe. But of course, as non-theists, we're not really convinced by that. We find no reason to suppose that the universe is not necessary. It's the only thing we know. And we also would not concede that God is necessary. That seems to be only something that a theist would say. We have no reason to say that. There's also the Kalam cosmological argument, which basically says that whatever begins to exist has a cause. I'm generally happy to concede it. We don't actually know that that's true. We're finding out weird things all the time with quantum mechanics. We don't actually know that that's the case. But I'm happy to concede that the big problem is in the second premise. The universe began to exist, and it's usually coupled with the idea that it's an absolute beginning and it's from nothing. The evidence we have for all of this is exactly zero. We don't know that the universe began to exist. We know that about 14 billion years ago something happened. The universe changed. What did it change from? We don't know. We're still trying to figure that out. So we can't say that there was an absolute beginning there. Also that it began from nothing. We have absolutely no evidence that there is a nothing. So we're sort of alluding here, the theist is alluding to substance dualism. I like to think of myself as a de facto monist. We have no evidence that there is something other than the natural world. We haven't established that the mind is something special, something mystical beyond the physical body. In fact, we've got a lot of science that disputes that, where you can tinker around with certain parts of the brain and it will change a person's personality. So we have absolutely no evidence that the universe began to exist from nothing. So we can forget the Kalam argument. Also, the Kalam argument, especially as people like Craig use it, tends to rely on the A theory of time. So there's different theories of time, and the A theory is basically a tense theory. There's the past, there's the future, there's the present. There's also the B theory, and these are really groups. We can simplify it. The B theory of time basically is sort of like a tenseless theory of time, where it actually just all exists. The past still exists, the future already exists, which raises all sorts of weird questions about free will and determinism. It's a bit freaky. But the interesting thing is most scientists and most philosophers that have anything to say about the theories of time favor the B theory. So it's interesting that if we're going to talk about who's fringe or not, such an argument relies on the fringe theory. Also, it somehow works out that the supposed cause of the universe happens to be God. Of course, we non-theists wouldn't really accept that. Okay, we've also got the fine-tuning argument. This is one of my favorites to deal with because if you know how to deal with it correctly, you can show that it's actually an argument against God's existence, which is quite funny. The way you often see it is that you're given a few options for how the universe is the way it is, why it seems fine-tuned for human life. One of the big objections to that is, well, why do we care about human life? Obviously we do, but objectively, do we know that we're so important? We tend not to think of ants as so important. I think maybe there's some extraterrestrial species out there much more evolved than we are. We'd be like ants to them. Is it really all about us? I think that's quite arrogant to think that. There's definitely no evidence for that. So the whole fine-tuning thing is sort of based on that misunderstanding, I suppose. Now, the options you're given for why this fine-tuning is present is that it's either necessary, it's just by chance, or it's by design, which, of course, that's God, it's a designer. And then the apologist will say, well, there's no evidence that the fine-tuning is necessary. There's also no evidence for chance. So you know what? Design wins by default. How great is that? Although, what if we changed the order? What if we said, hey, we don't have any evidence for design, we don't have any evidence for chance, yay, necessity wins. So it's a really bad argument for that one reason. There's many other reasons as well. And one interesting way, we can't go through all of it, this is very, very brief, but one reason why fine-tuning is a terrible argument for God is that it's actually a better argument against God's existence. And this is where we start thinking probabilistically. And one of the most reliable ways and maybe easy ways of thinking about things probabilistically is to use a Bayesian approach. So you're using prior probabilities and consequent probabilities. The prior probability would generally be the inherent plausibility of a theory. The consequent probability would be how expected the evidence is on that particular theory. So as an example, let's compare, and I don't argue for naturalism, I'm not a strong atheist, I'm a de facto naturalist, but I don't argue for strong naturalism, so I don't accept the burden of proof that I need to prove that God doesn't exist. But let's compare theism and naturalism. Now we observe the phenomenon of physical and natural fine-tuning. On naturalism, does anyone have any idea how expected that evidence is on that theory? How well do those two ideas go together? Physical fine-tuning and naturalism. There's no God. Does anyone have any idea? 100%. We wouldn't be here. If there's no God, there is a 100% chance that we're here because of physical fine-tuning. That's a pretty impressive consequent probability for naturalism. I wonder, what is the consequent probability for theism? Would that be 100%? This is generally how the apologist goes. They say, well, actually, you expect this design by a designer, so yeah, that should be 100%. Well, if it is, we've got equal consequent probabilities. With undetermined prior probabilities, we have to assign equal priors. We don't have an argument for God here, we've got 50-50, theism versus naturalism. But I put it to you that the consequent probability for theism when it comes to the evidence of fine-tuning is less than 100%. It could be around 0%, but I won't go that far. I'll give you 99.9999999%. A million nines in there. So basically, naturalism is 100% expected compared to theism, 99.9999%, whatever expected, meaning that the evidence of fine-tuning benefits naturalism. Now, you might be wondering, what the hell did you just do there? The reason why you would say this is more expected, or this is less expected rather, if God is responsible for our being here and our observing the universe and so forth, is that God is, I thought God was meant to be an all-powerful being. Is God limited to physical laws? Would God be limited to physical, natural fine-tuning? Of course that works perfectly for naturalism, but for God? Surely God can sustain us through magic, or whatever you want to call it, through his mystical powers. It doesn't have to be natural fine-tuning, does it? There's actually precedence for this information, for this sort of theory in the Bible as well, like Daniel in the lion's den. God is allowed Daniel's friends in the fire and so forth. So it's a really bad argument for God, it's a better argument against God. There's also a moral argument, and that just assumes that objective morality exists, which we only seem to know through our subjective thoughts, so that's a failure. Ontological argument is a bit silly. You can actually use that one as well to argue that God doesn't exist. Don't have time for that, unfortunately. We probably can look at it a bit later. And there's the personal experience argument, which is, it's not really an argument. I mean, we could go anyway. We could be talking about Shiva or Zeus or whoever. Going on the offensive, just quickly I want to say that there are alternative theories. There are alternative God concept. So even if we accept the basic arguments for God's existence, we don't actually have good reason to think that there's a theistic God. I think, for example, that pantheistic concepts of God better fit the evidence. Also, deistic concepts of God better fit the evidence. So the deistic God is a God that doesn't really care about us. And talking about one of the themes of the discussion here tonight, is God really there? We don't see the direct evidence of God's existence. Now, for a God that loves us, wants us to be saved, and so forth, knows how clever we are, it's unforgivable that God hasn't given us this evidence that's more consistent with a deistic God. So basically, theism is improbable, not only because of naturalism, but also because of the alternative God concepts. We'll talk more later in rebuttal time.
Gentlemen, back, I'm getting tired watching you. Why don't you come sit down? We've got some wonderful seats here. They're specially brought in, you know. It's got a very nice soft cushioned bottom. You're comfortable back.
Just down, just steady first. As long as the speakers don't speak.
I don't know the bottom. Robert's got 8 minutes. I'll just give a tap when you're...
Thanks very much, yeah. Well, thanks very much, Raphael, for some interesting food for thought. Tonight's debate is engaging the question, is God really there? As I said, I define God as a maximally great being, and he's objectively there. Now, Raphael has gone through some of the arguments from natural theology, which have often been rallied by people like William Lane Craig, who's unfortunately, well, if he was here tonight, then I suppose I wouldn't be speaking, so I'm not sure if that's necessarily a bad or a good thing. And so he went through some of the arguments from natural theology. As I said, the arguments from natural theology in my mind are certainly helpful and certainly point, I think, towards a theistic direction. But as I argued in my case, I think the strongest argument for the existence of God is through revelation. That we know God is there because he's been here. Now, unfortunately, Raphael didn't talk about that very much, but that's okay. We've got another session to talk about. But I think Raphael raised some very interesting points, and in a few minutes I just want to go through a couple of them and certainly try to seek some clarity. I certainly agree with Raphael that truth is not a democracy, that we can't just sort of make up what we want to be true. There are certain things that are true, things that are objectively or not. Raphael's asked a question about what's probably true. Now, as I argued, I think that the argument for the existence of God can be made in a quasi-probabilistic fashion. In fact, I was arguing for that in a sort of quasi sort of way, when I was suggesting that what is the probability that monotheistic Jews are going to invent a God figure? Now, we can put a number to that if you want, and that was the thing that I was arguing before, that in my mind is extremely unlikely. The probability is very, very low, and hence when a figure in a Jewish milieu comes and then claiming to be, I am God, what is the probability that person really is, say what they say to be? So to me, the probabilistic argument at that point, I think, again, gives further strength to the position that I was arguing, that it's unlikely that monotheistic Jews are going to be inventing a God-like figure. And similarly, what is the, as a sort of a quasi-probabilistic argument that I raised before about the comparison between the documentary evidence we have for Jesus and the claims that are there, the high Christology that's evident there, the probability of that compared in comparison to other ancient sources, other ancient documents. We have more earlier ancient documents and far better, closer to the time than for any ancient historian. So what is the probability, therefore, that they are likely to be more accurate, or likely to be sharing the things that they're claiming to be? Again, it's a probabilistic argument, and that's what it is. Again, it's a quasi-argument. And I think there's good probability that what is being said there is true. Now, Raphael made a number of points and began trying to deal with some of the philosophical arguments for the existence of God. But there was a couple of things that really stood out to me, and one of them was in the Kalam cosmological argument, which is a common argument that has been suggested. It's suggesting that the universe didn't actually have a beginning. Now, I'd be really interested to hear some modern physicists and cosmologists who would be promoting this theory, because modern understanding of science is based on the universe beginning 13.7 billion years ago or so. Now, I'm not I'm not a young Earth or young universe person. I do believe that there is reasonable belief to believe that the modern scientific record is reasonable and accurate. So I'm just astonished to work out how we can make the claim that the universe didn't actually have a beginning. And the way Raphael was explaining the Kalam cosmological argument is not to suggest that that because it's not actually, because God is not actually in the argument, the deductive argument as he put up, God is not actually up there. He's just trying to point out that the universe must therefore have a cause. Everything that begins must have a cause. And so that's the point that the argument is trying to say. There's a couple of other arguments about, for example, about fine-tuning, which I think is an interesting approach. The issue with the fine-tuning argument is not it's all about us. It's not trying to say that isn't it amazing that we're here. The argument from fine-tuning, as far as I know, and I'm not particularly persuaded by the argument from fine-tuning, just to make it clear, but I think there's just a couple of things that warranted being thought about. The argument is actually talking about why that there's so many constants in the universe and so finely calibrated that enable us to be here. So certain forces within the nuclei of the atom and so on, if they were slightly different, then the universe would expand too fast, it would be crunched on itself. And so physicists are just puzzled as to there's so many interesting coincidences. In fact, it meant that the famous cosmologist, Sir Fred Hoyle, made the statement that he said, he was an atheist, and he said that the universe looks like a put-up job, like a super intellect has monkeyed with the physics. Now this is an atheist person saying this. In fact, it moved him from being atheism to being somewhat agnostic about his belief, because he saw that the way that the universe was, the fine-tuning of the physical constants of the universe, meant that he thought there's some intelligent mind behind this. Now the really astonishing thing about Raphael's suggestions was that there actually is no objective reality. I find this a very interesting suggestion because what is if we want to push this to the ultimate conclusion, as I mentioned, one of the reasons that I think that there is a God is that we all believe in a certainty in morality. That we do believe that there are things that are right and are wrong, irrespective of our position. So what if we take Raphael's position to the ultimate, which means that if we go to another culture where they're offering, say, child sacrifices, or that in India where they used to do the funeral pyre where the widow would be burned with the man who died, in Raphael's conception, which I think is actually entirely consistent with an atheistic view, is that we actually can't condemn them. We actually have to say, well, that's just their culture, and we actually can't say it's wrong. Now, who am I to impose my view onto that culture? And that's effectively what the argument is. So it's interesting because many modern atheist philosophers and thinkers, particularly like Sam Harris, have been arguing that there actually is an objective framework from which we can say that things are ultimately right or wrong. Raphael tonight suggested that there is actually no objective moral values don't actually exist. And so we push that, which I think is actually entirely consistent with atheism. But again, that is not consistent with our experience. We deep down think that things are right and things are wrong. And I think this is where the atheist universe doesn't accord with our experience or our understanding of the world. So if there really are no objective moral values, then fine. We can't actually object to funeral pyre murders in India or child sacrifices elsewhere. Now, in terms of the burden of proof, I actually do think to get beyond agnosticism, you actually do have to demonstrate that the universe can be given without an agent, that the best explanation for the historical information about Jesus Christ is not theism, but actually is naturalism. You have to demonstrate that that's actually true. There is a burden to go beyond agnosticism to making a claim. So anyway, so as I said before, my argument rested on the idea that the best way we can know about God is that He's revealed Himself, that He has come. The best way we know that God is there is because He's been there. At the end of that, that's why I'm going to go. As I said, that there's good reasons to think that because there was an early belief that Jesus was God, in the context of Jewish monotheism, there was no immediate gains for those proposing this particular conception. Jesus demonstrated it with ways which would convince people that that He was who He was by doing a miracle. And we have extraordinary textual witness to that. So, again, I wanted to say that tonight's debate actually is about, is God really there? Oh, actually, I suppose also, just one final comment, was I think Raphael perhaps has given the game away. Tonight's debate is actually that God isn't there, and he says that the evidence seems to suggest that we are actually, there's good arguments for a pantheistic or a deistic God. Now, sure, there's a different kind of God conception to the one that I have, and that's why I said I could be a deist, but Raphael, I think, is just giving the game away. So thanks very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Raphael will give his last 8 minutes, and we'll break the drinks, which you can bring back into the bed.
Yeah, you might work backwards from that, because I found that an astounding claim that I said that there's a lot of evidence of pantheism. No, what I'm saying is that pantheism is a more probable God concept. I don't think we have any good evidence for any God concept whatsoever. I think the evidence tends to favour naturalism, actually. I'm saying that pantheism and other alternatives, like deism, are actually more probable than theism. That's what I'm saying. And you can say a similar thing with polytheism as well, simply because of the amount, the number of possible polytheisms. Working backwards, again, Robert was mentioning this thing about having to go beyond agnosticism. I don't see why. Atheists tend to be agnostics. I already said that I'm not a strong atheist or a hard naturalist, so there's no need to prove that God doesn't exist. But there's plenty of good evidence to suggest that specific God theory is actually quite improbable. As for morality, let's hear what Robert's argument for the existence of objective morality is. The argument is, deep down we think it's there. That's his argument for objective morality. That doesn't sound very objective to me. That sounds quite subjective. Deep down we think it's there. That's actually very subjective. We have zero evidence for objective morality. The rest of what he said about objective morality was pretty much just a straw person argument. Of course, we can say that certain things are not nice. We maybe can't say they're objectively wrong, but they're not things that we would want to happen to us or to the ones we love and so forth. Moving on, you also mentioned fine-tuning, and I don't think we heard anything interesting there about fine-tuning. He didn't comment on what I was talking about, that fine-tuning is a good argument against God, so I think he needs to deal with that. And he also did mention that I spent a lot of time talking about what's probably true. He didn't actually argue for theism being more probably true. In fact, he sort of deviated a bit, moving from theism to Christian theism, talking about Jesus, and that's usually a bit unorthodox when you're having a debate on God. But we can definitely deal with the Jesus issue. I think we've got some slides there. Yes, we had some talk about the Jesus myth theory, and that's also quite, that's a non sequitur really. We don't need to be talking about that. It's interesting that you raised Bart Ehrman as well for talking about how the historical Jesus is certainty. Bart Ehrman actually demolishes the biblical Jesus, and that's the Jesus that Marton, Robert believes in. So there really is no point to be talking about the historicity of Jesus, although I do a lot of work in that. We're not talking about that tonight. I'm quite happy to assume temporarily that Jesus did exist. I'm more interested in if the claims about Jesus are true, the Christian claims about Jesus. And that's what Robert was basically talking about in his opening discussion. And usually we talk about minimal facts, or apologists talk about minimal facts from the Gospels. None of these so-called minimal facts are actually established facts. We don't know. For example, there's the empty tomb. That apparently makes it more likely that Jesus was resurrected, and therefore we can believe Jesus' claims that God exists, that he is God. We actually haven't seen any good evidence for God's existence yet, so that's a bit jumping the gun, I think. But not all scholars actually agree that the empty tomb is an established fact. And all these little so-called established facts, they're not actually established facts. We don't actually know that these things happen. We have stories about these things happening, but we don't know they're actually true. But even if these were facts, we're more concerned with how implausible the claim is that Jesus was resurrected from the dead, or anything else that's miraculous. And we'll talk a bit about that, and why I say that naturalism and other God alternatives are more probable. And it's because of this prior probability. I mentioned before we use probabilistic reasoning, Bayesian reasoning. When it comes to prior probabilities, that was definitely wrong, what he said about our naturalistic assumptions, like assuming that miracles don't happen. I don't actually need to do that. We just need to talk probabilistically. So let's talk about the prior probability of the miraculous claims in the Gospels. Note that the Gospels are that trustworthy anyway. They're anonymous. We don't know who wrote them. There's only 4 canonical Gospels, and they all pretty much rely on Mark. There's a clear dependence there, so they're not independent sources, and we can't talk about hypothetical sources because they don't exist. Why would we talk about that? So we talk about prior probability. So what is the probability, or when we talk about prior probabilities, we talk about frequencies, historical frequencies. How often is it that a miraculous claim turned out to be true? Claims of people coming back from the dead. Well, you're mostly atheists, they're going to think, yeah, pretty low. Even for Christians, that would be pretty low, because they have to think that way about all the other religions. and their miraculous claims. So you have a low prior probability just based on the historical frequencies alone. That doesn't mean that Jesus' resurrection didn't happen, but it means we need really, really good evidence on the consequent side to overcome the low prior probability. We don't have that good evidence. We've got the 4 canonical Gospels, and they're dependent sources that come decades after the events. There's no reason to trust them. They get things wrong, and they're not good historians. We don't even know who wrote them. When we have ancient sources written by people that we know and trust, we don't even trust them half the time. Josephus is a pretty decent source from the ancient world. We don't trust him half the time. He was, there's political reasons for that, but also he mentions some very plausible things as well that we just don't trust. We have very little reason to trust the Gospels, and I don't think we heard any argument for why we should trust them. So I think that needs to be established. But not only can we say that miraculous claims and divine claims have a low prior probability based on historical frequencies, we can base it on science as well. We are forced to use the principle of analogy. We can't really assume that the ancient world was any different from this world. Why would we assume that a few thousand years ago things were different when the world is 4 billion years old or something like that? There's no reason to think that it was very different. And based on what we see today, we don't really see miracles. We don't see people coming back from the dead. We actually have claims of people coming back from the dead. We have contemporary evidence for that. It's still wrong. With Jesus, we don't even have contemporary evidence. We've got claims from decades later. And it's a good argument to say that, not that we're going to talk about it, whether the historical Jesus existed or not, but there's a good argument to say that actually the Gospels, specifically Mark, which is the first Gospel which the others really build on, is an allegorization of Paul's writings. And if you read Paul's writings, you will know there's nothing unambiguously there about a historical Jesus, a person that was recently on earth. It fits very well with the idea that Jesus was a celestial being. So this could very well be a religion that started like Mormonism, like Islam, like other religions, where you actually have an angel sending messages to a prophet. And maybe Paul or Cephas was one such prophet. So we have very little reason to trust the Christian sources. Without that, we don't really have a case for Jesus. So pretty much that was what the case for God over here was all about. It was about Jesus. Not really successful. So the conclusion is everything we see is pretty consistent with a naturalistic worldview. Not that I'm a hard naturalist, but it's also more consistent with alternative God concepts like pantheism. I don't think pantheism is true. I think it's a pretty nifty God concept, and especially pandeism, which mixes elements of deism, the God that doesn't care, with monism, which I think we have to be de facto monists because we have no evidence of substance dualism. I think it's pretty clear that there are God concepts much more plausible than theism. There's in fact infinitely many. And yes, so I think I've kind of spoken a bit about why we shouldn't really trust the case for God that we've heard. I tend to rely more on Jesus than about God, the evidence for God himself or herself. And also I've given you some reasons. We didn't have time to go through them all, maybe another time. But there are a lot of reasons why we would think that the God of theism is particularly implausible. And I think that's about it. Thanks very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, it really gives me great pleasure to see Raphael recognise the Trinity with the Barcelona forwards. It is really awesome. We're going to have a 10-minute break and we'll see you back soon.